The summer heat pressed down on the Pico Union neighborhood like a weighted blanket soaked in sweat and diesel fumes. It was August 1989, and Carlos Mendoza, 16 years old, stood outside the corner store on 18th Street, watching two girls walk past. One of them, Maria, smiled at him. Just smiled. That smile would cost 7 lives before the week ended. Carlos was MS-13, marked by the 3 dots tattooed between his thumb and index finger. Maria's boyfriend, Miguel Flores, ran with the 18th Street gang, and he'd seen that smile too. What happened next wasn't just another gang beef in a city drowning in them. It was the spark that ignited a war spanning 4 decades, 2 countries, and leaving a body count that would make cartel bosses nod in respect. The rivalry between MS-13 and 18th Street would become the bloodiest gang conflict in American history. A transnational killing machine that turned neighborhoods into war zones and prisons into slaughterhouses. Before the blood, there was brotherhood. Before the bullets, there were just scared kids trying to survive. Los Angeles in the early 1980s was a pressure cooker of racial tension, economic collapse, and refugees flooding in from wars most Americans couldn't find on a map. The Salvadorans arrived by the thousands, running from a civil war that had turned their country into a mass grave. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs and trauma embedded so deep in their DNA that violence felt like a second language. In the Rampart and Pico Union districts, these Salvadoran kids found themselves surrounded by established Mexican gangs who didn't want them, black gangs who saw them as invaders, and white supremacists who wanted them dead. They needed protection. They needed family. They created MS-13. The name itself was a declaration of identity and defiance. Mara Salvatrucha, the Salvadoran street gang. 13 for the 13th letter of the alphabet, M for Mexican Mafia, the prison gang they hoped would protect them inside. In those early days, MS-13 was small, maybe 30 kids with hand-me-down weapons and more heart than sense. They weren't the sophisticated criminal enterprise they'd become. They were just teenagers who'd watched their fathers disappear in El Salvador, who'd seen their mothers raped by soldiers, who'd crossed the desert into a country that promised opportunity, but delivered only more violence. Some of those kids, desperate for acceptance, actually joined the 18th Street gang first. 18th Street, or Barrio 18, was already an institution by the time the Salvadorans showed up. Founded in the 1960s around 18th Street in the Rampart district, it had started as a Mexican-American gang but had evolved into something more diverse. They recruited anyone who could prove themselves: Mexicans, Hondurans, Guatemalans, even a few white kids from broken homes. They were ruthless but pragmatic. When young Salvadorans approached them wanting to join, 18th Street saw recruits, bodies to throw at their rivals. For a brief moment, there was coexistence. Salvadoran kids wearing 18th Street colors, fighting 18th Street's wars, dying for neighborhoods that would never truly accept them. But ethnic tensions simmered beneath the surface like lava waiting for a crack. Mexican members of 18th Street called the Salvadorans guanacos, a slur that carried centuries of regional prejudice. The Salvadorans, combat-hardened by a war that made LA gang violence look like playground fights, didn't take disrespect well. When MS-13 started recruiting aggressively, pulling Salvadoran kids away from 18th Street, the older gang saw it as betrayal. Territory that had been 18th Street for decades suddenly had MS-13 graffiti crossing it out. Respect, that currency more valuable than drugs or money in gang culture, was being challenged. Then came that August night in 1989. The details vary depending on who's telling the story, but the core remains consistent. Maria had dated Miguel Flores, a shot caller for one of the 18th Street cliques, for almost a year. But Miguel had a temper and fists that moved faster than his brain. After one beating too many, Maria left him, started seeing Carlos, the young MS-13 member who treated her like she mattered. In any other context, this would be a simple story of a girl choosing a better guy. In Pico Union, it was a declaration of war. Miguel couldn't let it stand. In gang logic, losing your girl to a rival wasn't just personal humiliation. It was a sign of weakness, and weakness got you killed. Miguel and 4 other 18th Street members found Carlos walking home from the store, probably still thinking about Maria's smile. They pulled up in a stolen Honda Civic, and before Carlos could react, Miguel emptied a .38 revolver into him. 6 shots. 2 hit Carlos in the chest, 1 in the neck. He died on the sidewalk bleeding out while neighbors watched from behind curtains, too afraid to help, too familiar with the sound of gunfire to even call 911 anymore. Maria found out the next morning, went to identify the body, screamed so loud they could hear it 3 blocks away. MS-13 found out an hour after that. By nightfall, they'd decided on their response. The retaliation came 3 days later during a house party in the Westlake neighborhood, 18th Street territory. MS-13 didn't just hit back, they made a statement. 8 members rolled up on the party at 1 a.m., kicked in the door, and opened fire with everything they had. Handguns, shotguns, an AK-47 one of them had bought from a gun runner in Tijuana. When the shooting stopped, 4 18th Street members were dead, along with 2 girls who'd just been there to dance, and 1 12-year-old kid who'd been sleeping in the back bedroom. The LAPD found 147 shell casings. The survivors wouldn't talk, wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't even confirm their own names. In that silence, everyone understood. This wasn't ending. This was just beginning. The violence escalated with mathematical precision. MS-13 hit an 18th Street crack house. 18th Street retaliated by firebombing a building where MS-13 members' families lived. MS-13 killed an 18th Street shot caller at a stoplight in broad daylight. 18th Street responded by killing 2 MS-13 members and leaving their bodies in MacArthur Park with their gang tattoos carved off. Each attack required a response. Each response required escalation. The neighborhoods became kill zones where children learned to hit the floor at the sound of car engines slowing down, where mothers kissed their sons goodbye every morning not knowing if they'd see them alive again, where the coroner's office ran out of body bags and had to order more in bulk. By 1992, both gangs had evolved beyond simple street crews into sophisticated criminal organizations. MS-13 had established a reputation for particular brutality. They didn't just kill enemies, they mutilated them, sending messages that would make seasoned detectives vomit at crime scenes. Machetes became their signature weapon, a callback to the death squads in El Salvador, a psychological tool that spread terror more effectively than bullets. One MS-13 member, when asked why they used machetes, responded simply, "Bullets are quick. We want them to understand what's coming." 18th Street, meanwhile, had numbers. They were everywhere. Cliques in every major neighborhood in LA. Connections to the Mexican mafia that gave them prison protection and drug distribution networks. Where MS-13 had maybe a few hundred active members in the early 90s, 18th Street had thousands. The LAPD tried everything: gang injunctions, sweep operations, federal task forces. They'd arrest 50 gang members in a weekend, and by Monday, the survivors had recruited 50 more. The problem was systemic and generational. These weren't kids joining gangs for fun or money, though both played roles. They were joining for survival, for identity, for family in a city that had abandoned them. A 14-year-old Salvadoran kid living in Pico Union had 2 choices: join MS-13 and have protection, or stay neutral and get targeted by both sides for not choosing. Neutrality wasn't an option. The gangs were filling a vacuum that parents, schools, police, and society had left empty. Then the federal government made a decision that would transform a Los Angeles gang war into an international crisis. In 1996, Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, dramatically expanding the categories of crimes that would result in automatic deportation. Gang membership became grounds for removal, even for legal permanent residents who'd lived in the U.S. since childhood. Between 1996 and 2000, the U.S. deported over 50,000 criminals to Central America, including thousands of MS-13 and 18th Street members. The government thought they were solving a problem. They were actually metastasizing it. These gang members arrived in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala as strangers in their supposed homeland. They'd left as children, returned as adults with American accents, American gang culture, and American weapons training. They spoke English better than Spanish. They knew Pico Union better than San Salvador. But they had gang connections. They had criminal skills, and they arrived in countries with weak governments, corrupt police forces, and populations traumatized by civil wars. It was perfect conditions for metastasis. Within 5 years, MS-13 and 18th Street had established sophisticated operations throughout Central America, recruiting desperate local kids and bringing the LA gang war to countries that had barely recovered from their own conflicts. In El Salvador, the violence reached levels that made LA look peaceful. The homicide rate exploded. By 2015, El Salvador had become the murder capital of the world, with 103 homicides per 100,000 people. For context, a U.S. city with that rate would see roughly 330,000 murders per year. The gang war had gone home to the very countries these kids' parents had fled, and it was worse than the Civil War that had driven them to America in the first place. The irony was crushing. The violence had come full circle, exported by the country that was supposed to be refuge, implanted in soil already soaked with blood. The war manifested differently in Central America. In LA, gang violence had to navigate police, rival gangs, and turf boundaries. In El Salvador, MS-13 and 18th Street essentially controlled entire neighborhoods, collected extortion payments from buses and businesses, and operated with impunity. The government response was heavy-handed and counterproductive. They implemented mano dura policies, iron fist policing that arrested anyone with gang tattoos, threw them in overcrowded prisons where MS-13 and 18th Street continued operations from inside the walls. Prison became gang headquarters, a place where young arrestees got deeper indoctrination, where shot callers planned operations, where the distinction between inside and outside became meaningless. One of the most documented examples of the international dimension came in February 2010, in a neighborhood called Mexicanos just outside San Salvador. A local MS-13 member, 19 years old, was killed by 18th Street in a dispute over drug territory. The response was calculated and public. On the evening of February 20th, armed members of 18th Street set up roadblocks on the main highway through Mexicanos. They stopped 3 buses, ordered everyone off, checked IDs and looked for gang tattoos, asked questions designed to identify MS-13 members or sympathizers. They found 14 people with MS-13 connections, some members, some just relatives. One kid was just wearing blue, MS-13's color. All 14 were executed on the side of the highway with assault rifles. The bodies were left as a message. The government response was to arrest everyone with 18th Street tattoos they could find, which only intensified the cycle. Back in Los Angeles, the war continued with different dynamics but the same brutality. County jail became a battleground. In Men's Central Jail, deputies had to keep MS-13 and 18th Street in completely separate areas because placing them together guaranteed riots. Even in maximum security, members would craft weapons from anything available. Toothbrushes sharpened into shanks, razors melted into plastic handles, all waiting for the moment a rival appeared in a hallway or a shower room. In 2006, a massive riot broke out in Pitch's detention center, when 18th Street members somehow breached the separation protocols and ambushed an MS-13 housing unit. 40 inmates were injured, 2 died, and the entire facility had to be locked down for 3 weeks. The gangs also evolved their economic models. Early on, both MS-13 and 18th Street were primarily into low-level street crime, car theft, burglary, small-time drug dealing. By the 2000s, they'd diversified. Human smuggling became a major revenue stream, charging migrants thousands of dollars to cross the border, often robbing or killing those who couldn't pay the full amount. Extortion rackets expanded beyond Central America back into LA, targeting immigrant businesses that couldn't or wouldn't report to police. Protection payments of $100 a week from a pupusa stand might not sound like much, but multiply that by 1,000 businesses, and suddenly you're generating serious money. One gang investigator with the LAPD told a researcher in 2008 something that perfectly captured the evolution. In the 90s, these kids were fighting over girls and street corners. Now they're running multinational criminal enterprises with cells in 6 countries, revenue streams in 8 figures, and communication networks that would make corporations jealous. They adapted, they evolved, and we're still policing them like they're the same street punks from 1989. The transnational nature created bizarre dynamics. An 18th Street member deported to Honduras might order a hit on an MS-13 member in Los Angeles using a cell phone. The shooter might be a 15-year-old kid in Pico Union who'd never met the target or the person ordering the hit. The murder would then spark retaliation in both LA and Honduras, creating a feedback loop of violence that crossed borders and generations. Researchers studying gang networks called this the Hydra effect. Cut off one head, 2 more appear. Except the heads were in different countries and operating independently while still feeding the same beast. But violence creates exhaustion. By 2012, even gangsters were tired. In El Salvador, homicides had become so routine that newspapers couldn't cover them all. The economy was collapsing because businesses refused to operate in gang-controlled areas. Families were fleeing north, creating a new refugee crisis. The Salvadoran government, desperate and out of options, did something unprecedented. They negotiated. They approached MS-13 and 18th Street leadership in prison with a proposal. Reduce the killings, agree to a truce, and they'd improve prison conditions, allow conjugal visits, transfer shot callers to less restrictive facilities. The Catholic Church mediated. In March 2012, the gangs agreed. The truce held for almost 2 years, a miracle in a conflict that had known only escalation. Homicides in El Salvador dropped by 60% almost overnight. For the first time in decades, you could walk through certain neighborhoods without hearing gunfire. But truces built on pragmatism rather than resolution are fragile. The Salvadoran government started backtracking on promises. Prison conditions didn't improve significantly. Transfers didn't happen. And crucially, neither gang actually wanted peace. They wanted advantage. Both MS-13 and 18th Street used the truce to reorganize, recruit, and rearm. By 2014, the violence returned, worse than before. What killed the truce definitively was a new president who ran on a mano dura platform. President Salvador Sánchez Cerén, a former guerrilla commander, believed negotiating with gangs was weakness. He ordered maximum pressure, mass arrests, prison transfers designed to separate leadership, even tacit permission for police to use lethal force. The gangs responded by targeting police. Between 2014 and 2016, over 250 Salvadoran police officers were killed, many off-duty, ambushed at home or in buses, executed to send a message. El Salvador descended into what analysts call a low-intensity conflict, not quite civil war, but far beyond ordinary criminal violence. The reverberations reached LA. As El Salvador cracked down, gang members fled north, some legally, many illegally. bringing intensified conflicts back to where it all started. A new generation of MS-13 members, radicalized by combat-level violence in Central America, arrived in California with experience that made the original LA gangsters look like amateurs. They'd survived death squads. They'd operated in true war zones. They didn't fear LAPD. One longtime gang detective said in 2016, "The kids we're arresting now, they're not scared of prison. They're not scared of death. They grew up in El Salvador during the war. This is mild to them." One incident in 2017 crystallized how the gang war had evolved. In January, 4 young men were found dead in a park in Long Island, New York, beaten and hacked with machetes. Their bodies discovered by a woman walking her dog. MS-13 claimed responsibility. The victims were allegedly 18th Street, though families disputed this, but the location was significant. Long Island, 3,000 miles from Pico Union, a community with no historical gang presence. The gang war had spread through deportation, migration, and recruitment to literally every corner of America with a Central American population. The conflict was no longer about LA neighborhoods or even El Salvador. It had metastasized into a permanent condition. A low-level war with no clear front lines and no conceivable victory condition for either side. By 2023, both gangs face new pressures. MS-13, designated as a transnational criminal organization by the Treasury Department, faces federal prosecution under organized crime statutes that carry life sentences. Leaders have been extradited to the U.S. for trial, cutting off the head repeatedly, though the Hydra keeps growing new ones. 18th Street, less unified than MS-13 because of their diverse recruitment and looser structure, has fragmented into sub-factions that sometimes fight each other as much as they fight MS-13. But the core rivalry remains. A young kid in Pico Union today faces the same choice as Carlos did in 1989. Join MS-13, join 18th Street, or leave. The human cost defies calculation. The National Gang Center estimates between 1989 and 2023, the MS-13 and 18th Street conflict has resulted in at least 50,000 deaths across the U.S. and Central America, though the real number is likely far higher, because many murders go unsolved. Many bodies are never found, and many countries don't accurately track gang-related homicides. 50,000 deaths is the population of a small city, wiped out over a rivalry that started with a smile and a teenage romance. But statistics don't capture the grandmother who lost her son to MS-13, her grandson to 18th Street, and now lives in a one-room apartment in MacArthur Park, too afraid to go outside after dark. They don't capture the LAPD officer who spent 20 years investigating gang murders, who knows the names of 300 dead kids, who dreams about crime scenes and wakes up exhausted. They don't capture the former MS-13 member who left the gang, moved to Montana to escape his past, and still checks over his shoulder every time he hears Spanish because the war follows you forever. They don't capture the Salvadoran mother sending her 12-year-old son alone on the journey to America because staying means he'll be recruited by one gang or killed by the other. And a dangerous journey is better than certain death. The legacy of the MS-13 and 18th Street War is written in blood, grief, and 1,000 might-have-beens. What if the U.S. immigration system had better integrated refugees? What if LA had invested in community programs instead of aggressive policing? What if deportation policy had considered consequences? What if? What if? What if? The answers don't matter anymore because the war has achieved a kind of permanence. A self-sustaining system where violence creates conditions that create more violence, where traumatized kids grow into traumatized adults who raise traumatized kids, where gang membership becomes hereditary not through genetics, but through circumstance. Today, Pico Union looks different than it did in 1989. There's a new Korean barbecue place where the store Carlos died in front of used to stand. The neighborhood has gentrified in patches, though poverty persists in others. But the gang war continues. Quieter maybe, less visible, but no less deadly. Just last month, an 18-year-old MS-13 member was shot dead outside a quinceañera. Retaliation came 4 days later when 18th Street killed 2 MS-13 in a drive-by. The cycle continues because no one knows how to stop it. Because the roots run too deep. Because the war has outlived the memories of what started it. There's a memorial in MacArthur Park, a simple plaque listing names of gang violence victims from 1989 to 2020. The list runs 7 feet long, names in small print, dates of birth and death creating a mathematical proof of wasted potential. At the bottom, in both English and Spanish, it reads, "May their deaths teach us that violence only births more violence." But the lesson hasn't been learned. The war between MS-13 and 18th Street continues, and somewhere tonight in Pico Union another teenager is making the choice that will define whether he sees 20, a choice that shouldn't exist, in a war that should have ended decades ago, but instead became the longest gang conflict in American history. A war without winners, only survivors and ghosts.